started to celebrate Black History Week. Actually, that really wasn't the beginning of that event. It really goes the whole way back to 1926. And at that time, it was called Negro History Week. And for the 1980s, I think, will be changing the title again, because officially now, February is the month for Afro-American History Month. And I only found that out today. The idea of first celebrating a special week goes back to the birthday of Frederick Douglass, whose birthday is on February 12th. And in the very beginning, the week was always the week of his birthday. That's how it was determined. It was first begun by the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History. And the important person who really began that organization is someone with whom I'm not familiar. I'm sure there are people here who know the name of Carter Goodwin Woodson. Probably, I gather, one of the most astute early historians of Black history in the United States today, or during his time. He died in the 40s, I believe. We have here in the library several of his books, which I found interesting to look at. Some of you might care also to explore that. I think today we might consider this a sort of show and tell day for the event. We have a couple people in our audience who are doing special things, and most importantly, we have John Pinkman with us today, who has many things to show and tell. Lois Pearson, who carved up those nice sandwiches for us in there while she was carving sandwiches, told me the story of this painting. And I said, Lois, would you go home and get it? And so Lois has this hanging in her living room. And I'd like to ask Lois to tell to everybody the tale she told me of this painting, because I think it's such a great story. Would you do that, Lois?
All right. From here?
If you go up there with the painting, then Timothy can record you and the painting.
Right. Well, the painting goes back to the 40s during the Second World War. My father was a mailman on the route that covered Collinsville and the Hollow. And he went to Whitty Richards. And at Whitty Richards, they announced to him that they were losing their accountant because he was being drafted. So Daddy rushed home and he said, oh, Wanda, you can do that. They need someone so badly. So Mother could do that. And so she went and she was the accountant. And while she was there, she would come about 5 o'clock in the morning to paint these paintings. There were, I think, 6 drivers of the coal trucks at the time, and they would come in sparkling and beautiful and just radiantly clean before the day began, and she would have them pose, and they just loved it, and she loved doing it. And by the end of the day, they were no fit subjects for painting, but they were wonderful men. And each one of them went back to their families, except this one. And I don't know his name. I think it's Mr. T-Bow.
T-Bow, that's his name.
Yes.
I recognize it.
Oh, don't tell them I have it. Because I just love it. And I don't want to ever give it up. And that's the story.
I'm sure there are many other like tales to be told, and I think the more we have this kind of a celebration, the more you find out just such things. During this past week in Morristown, we had the beginnings of a survey of historic sites, and Fran Pajon is here. And Fran, would you tell us about that project?
Yeah.
The state of New Jersey, last June, decided to undertake a survey of black historic places in the state of New Jersey. And these are places that are associated with the history of blacks in New Jersey in some significant way. Well, this week, Bob Craig, who's the project coordinator, came to Morristown from Trenton to see Mr. Pinkman, who's with us today. And Mr. Pinkman drove us around Morristown and pointed out different houses and places that were associated with the history of his people. And it was extremely interesting. And I think the idea of this project is to learn much more about black history through places where history has actually happened. And it was, they've been all over the state. I think they have now 200 preliminary sites which they are researching. This is the Historical Commission in New Jersey, and they're waiting for a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to continue this. And they have on their board a great many prominent black historians, plus they have the head of the Colored Women's Club, Federation of Women's Clubs, am I right, Joan?
Yes.
She's being very helpful, and they're going into the communities and asking people to tell what they know about the history there. They're reaching down into the communities, and it really has only begun. So I imagine many of you here will be hearing from this project, from the people in this project, and wanting any history that you may know, because the grant has not yet been received, but I gather it will be, and it will be a 3-year project. So anyone who knows anything of interest, I'm sure you'll be contacted. Thank you.
Thank you. As you came down the center aisle, I hope you didn't walk too quickly by the exhibit in our small exhibit case. John Pinkman very kindly today brought to us some of his special Haitian treasures. And I think it's possible to stand before that exhibit and admire what you see there. But it's quite another thing to hear John tell about it. I think that probably when you take your return trip and walk by that exhibit after we hear from John, it will probably have a lot more meaning to you than it did when you had your first look at it. John Pinkman is one of the most venerable gentlemen in our community, and it's always a pleasure when John comes here or when John is present wherever we go. And you never really know what John's going to say next. I always feel, well, I wish I had my tape recorder on when he speaks so that I could put it down. Early this afternoon, we were over here in the corner, and I felt that way then. He then was talking about Kate Macy Ladd. So I'm just eager to hear John and the things he's going to tell us about his 30-odd trips to Haiti and some of the background of the island. John, you may say whatever you want.
Well, first of all, I haven't been there 30 sometimes, but I've been about 16 or 17 times. I happened to go down because I grew up here, and the Bishop of Haiti, for 35 years, Alfred Vogley, was a very close friend of mine. In fact, he was a Sunday school teacher of mine in church, and so I went down there to visit him. He was not only Bishop of Haiti, but he was Bishop of the Dominican Republic too for many years until they had a bishop of their own. This is the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church. And so that's one reason I was there so often. Haiti, as you know, is a country, it's the second country in the Western Hemisphere to win its independence. After we did, we won ours, I think, well, the war of 1776, about 1789, I guess, when our treaty was signed, I think somewhere along there, 87 or 89, 1787 or 79, 89, I can't really remember exactly. Well, Haiti won its independence from France in 1803, and it was the second country in this hemisphere. And they at first had a monarchy, and Christophe was their emperor, and they ruled the whole of the island of Hispaniola, which is composed of two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They, after about 30 years, gave the Dominican Republic their independence because it was a Spanish-speaking country, and Haiti was a French-speaking country. And so you had there a nobility, and they intermarried with some of the French nobility, and they continued this until Christophe died, this type of rule, and then they became a republic. And it's, I must say, it's been sort of backward country, as many of those countries in South America and Africa have been. They haven't really advanced very fast. It has two groups of people, you might say. You're either very well off or you're very poor. There are about 4 million people there, and most of these people are peasants and quite poor. Those who are well off are very well off, extremely well off, and very cultivated. I'm extremely cultivated. They live in a manner that people lived in Europe 100 years ago. For instance, if someone invites you for dinner, they don't go to you on the phone or send you a note by mail. They send it to you by messenger, especially if you're in the same town, and it's sent on a lovely little silver tray with a serviette and napkin wrapped around it, and you answer right away and send a note back whether you're coming or not. This is the way people did things 100 years ago. They're still doing it. So it's how much country it is. But those who are cultivated are very much so. Now, within the last 30 years, 25 years, their art, which is primitive art, has become very popular in the world. And we're very happy about this. Bishop Bowlby was one of the persons who opened this art up to the world. Prior to his going down there in 41, their art was not known, only there. But after he went down, he got some of our people who are noted in the art world to go down, and among them was Mr. Mellon. And of course, this sort of put the art right out in front, and so the Haitian art has become quite well known now in many areas where it wasn't known before, and it's become quite expensive to buy. Also, they're carving. They're always great carvers, wood carvers. They're mahogany. So you'll see in the case there, the display case, some of the two Haitian primitives, paintings, and several carvings, where they're done. I've gotten those down there. You'll also see a lovely little inlay box, which was some of the work that they do. And there's a pair of a salad fork and spoon, which is carved out of tortoiseshell, which is really quite an art. The tortoise, and they carved these spoons, forks out of the tortoise shell. Also, in the display case, there's a money exchange from Liberia, which is another early African independence country. They were founded in 1820 by freed slaves from the United States, and it was during the time of President Monroe. And so their capital is named Monrovia in honor of President Monroe. And the former bishop of Liberia, Bishop Robert Harris, was a very good friend of mine, and so he brought me back this exchange money. I think it's copper. And it used to be their manner of exchange in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, soon after it was founded. And this is quite rare, and I'm very happy to have 3 pieces of it. And so you'll find that also in the case there. Also in the case is a picture of Booker T. Washington, who was called the Great Educator. Now, this man went to Hampton Institute, incidentally, and he founded Tuskegee Institute later on in Alabama. Hampton is in Virginia. This is rather interesting. Just the other day, we read in the paper where the Cape Macy Ladd home is going to close here, and Mr. Ladd, who was a very wonderful and very brilliant lawyer in New York, he had this great place, one of his places, because they lived in 4 or 5 places during the year. People used to do that. People of means, they'd live a few months here and a few months there, and all these places were staffed. And Morristown was filled with those kind of families when I was a boy. And but anyway, in the paper the other night, we all read that Mr. Ladd had left his estate to be divided among 3 or 4 schools. 2 of these schools are Hampton and Tuskegee. Now, Dr. Washington founded Tuskegee. He was a graduate of Hampton. My mother knew him when she was a student, and he used to come and stay with us sometimes. When he had a great tour of New Jersey in 1914, he stayed with us overnight, I think 2 or 3 nights at that time. And in those days, you see, black people couldn't stay in the hotels. And if you were these educators, these early educators, they had to present what they were trying to do to the public. And they were dependent on the gifts of the very wealthy people. So they would come north and give lectures. Now, they had to stay somewhere while they were giving the lectures. And so they usually stayed with, unless one of the very wealthy families took them in for the night or the period of time that they were going to be here to give the talks. They stayed with some black family that had a house big enough to keep them and could keep them for nothing. This was your contribution to their effort. You couldn't give $10,000 or $50,000, but you could keep them overnight or 2 or 3 nights and feed them while they could present their subject to the people who could afford to make gifts to them. And this is what happened. And so Dr. Washington and Mary McLeod Bethune and many of those people used to spend the night with us. And as a little boy, I can remember this. And I'd sit in the corner, as you would be seen and not heard when I grew up. You sat in the corner and listened. You didn't open your mouth. After they were gone, you could ask some questions, and maybe you were answered if you asked the right questions, and maybe you weren't. It all depended on the questions you asked. But it was a wonderful experience to have known some of these people. So you'll find Dr. Washington's picture in there too. Getting back to the Cape Macy Ladd thing, evidently Mr. Ladd must have been I think he must have been a trustee probably at Hampton, because from what I gather, they're going to get about $6.25 million apiece. Isn't that wonderful? It's just wonderful when you think about it. 50 years gone by, but this man had this wonderful, wonderful vision, and he's leaving these schools, which needed very much. And during that interim period, ever since Mrs. Ladd died, which is about 18 years, the home has been used for worthy women who couldn't afford to go places for their convalescence. They've been able to stay there for nothing. Think of that. Now, this is really, really a wonderful thing. And now the estate is going to be divided among these schools. It's just wonderful when you think about it. And that man, we should bless him wherever he is. And hopefully, I'm sure he's in a good place. But also in that cabinet, you will find a shuttle. Now, the shuttle is from a loom, and this loom belonged to my great-great-great-grandmother, and it dates back to about 1790. And she was the main seamstress, and she was also a midwife on a plantation in Virginia that belonged to a family by the name of Good, G-O-O-D-E. in Mecklenburg County, Virginia. And she's also the ancestor of some of our local families, a family named Burton and another McCleary. The Watkins here in Morristown was under, of course, the Pinkmans, ourselves. She was all our great-great-great-grandmother. And it's rather interesting because this is a pretty old piece to have had in the family all this length of time. It should really go in a museum because I don't think many people have that sort of thing anymore. I think they've been destroyed through the years, you know. Also, there are some pictures there up on the side, pinned up, which are of Boyden Institute. Now, Boyden Institute is now defunct, it's no longer in existence. But it was founded in 1868, and it was founded by, among the people founded were some local people. A very wealthy family in town by the name of Graves. They lived on South Street where the beneficial building is now. There used to be great mansions along South Street. When I was a boy, they were still there. And the Graveses were trustees at this school. And the school, before it was Boyden Institute, it was the old Macon Randolph College, which is still in existence in Virginia. And it moved from Boyden, the Macon Randolph College, to its present site. And when the war was over, the Civil War, now these pictures were all taken out of a book which a Miss Susie Lee Bracey published in 1978, which had to do with the 300 years of the Old Dominion, which is a colony of Virginia. And she has in the book 3 chapters on the colored families of Virginia. And this was taken out of the book. And I have the book at home. In fact, Miss Bracey sent me the book because she said, your family's in it and you ought to have the book. And so she sent it to me for nothing. I was very pleased about that. Well, now that takes care, I think, of it, practically everything in the cabinet there. In the library, the children's library, there's a painting that I brought. It was done by Susu Graddick, who is the daughter of a former black physician here in Morristown for about 45 years. And she painted it while she was a student at New York University and won the first prize on this painting. And when her parents died, they were very, very close friends of ours. And so she gave it to me as a present. So I brought that along, and it's in the other room in the children's library up on the top of the bookcase there. I think that takes care of the things that I brought today. Of course, the Mr. Tebow here, I just speak of him because I remember him very, very well. He has some relatives here still, but no children. He never had any children. And I remember him very well. He came of one of the old families, not Southern families. You see, we were descended from, our families came to Jersey from Virginia in the 1880s, and we were the first of the colored families to come up from Virginia. I mean, to come north. But these people were Northerners. They were Northern blacks who evidently probably had been slaves here, and they were here all along. Mrs. Pigeon was just saying something about it. When we went around this week to look at the old houses where blacks had lived in, and we went to some houses that were blacks. It was given to blacks in 1790 along Mount Kimball Avenue. And this man was connected with some of those families who'd been here all along. The T-boats were, well, they pronounce it T-bout or Tabo. It can be pronounced Tabo, but I think they've always pronounced it T-bout. I think the proper pronunciation is really Tabo, because it's a French name. And it really should be Tabo. But anyway, his family were among those who were connected to a group of people called Jackson Whites, who were descended from Indians and runaway slaves and deserters from the British Army, the Hessians, the German soldiers who were deserters from the British Army. They settled along the range of mountains that runs from Chester to Warwick, New York. And they lived back in the hills there, and they didn't come out. They just didn't come out of there. They stayed maybe intermarried with each other. Now, this man's family came out because they've been in Morristown a long, long time. But most of those people who lived back in the mountains there, they intermarried, and so they didn't come out of there until they began coming out in 1914, 17, the First World War. They were drafted, and that brought them out, the men. And then once they got out and found out there were other people in the world besides themselves, they began to marry outside, and so that sort of made them come out. But you still go back up in the mountains there, and you find these people who are really isolated, and they're shy of you. They, for 200 and some years, they've just lived among themselves, and it's quite interesting. Well, Mr. Tabo, or T-bow, whatever you want, however you want to call it, he was really one of those people, and I remember him very well. I don't think he's alive now. I think he's dead. I just spoke of that because I remember when you said Willie Richards Coal Company, I knew right away who you were talking about.
Oh, wonderful.
We bought our coal from Willie Richards and Pruden and Burke for 73 years. We're still buying fuel from the man who bought Willie Richards.
I wish I could remember the names of the other men so you could tell me about them too, but.
Well, I remember all those people very well. I remember when they had horse-drawn vehicles that brought your coal and put it in. My mother used to buy her coal in June. It took 16 tons of coal to heat her house, and every June she put in 16 tons of coal. So you had it. You didn't have to worry about it.
There was a very Spanish-looking one that was one of Mother's subjects that always wore a cap, a very, very large one at a jaunty angle. You don't happen to remember what his name was?
Yes, now his name was...
Very handsome.
Yes, very handsome. He was a Jackson White. And his name was, he's got a son here, still. Richie.
Richie.
His name
Yes,
is Richie,
that's
his
right,
last
that's
name.
right.
Yes. And the Richies came from Warwick, up in that area, Warwick, New York. And they were all very handsome.
Very,
Very handsome people. And he has a son here in the taxi business, I think. He has a son, Richie. Isn't he in the taxi business?
What's his first name?
Well, I can't think of his first name. He's younger than I am, though. He's married to a Harris.
That's my uncle, that's why
There you are. Artie Dexter, and that's right. He's married to a Harris. Yeah.
It's a small world.
Yeah, it's a small world.
It is.
Well, if you've been in Morristown for an old family, I know who you are.
Are you,
I don't know the new people, but
are you related to the Pinkmans off of Whippany Road?
he's my nephew.
John, when they delivered the coal, did they pour it down a chute, or did they carry it in on baskets?
No, down chute. They only carried it on baskets if there wasn't a place accessible to
No
the
coal
cellar.
hole, huh?
And it was down chute. The wagons had an opening at the back, so they could back up and raise the wagon, and the body end it would shoot in, or an opening at the side. They shoveled it in then. It was close to it. It was shoveled down the chute, and then there would be a man in a cellar who would pull it aside so that the bin would be right up to your floor. I remember our 16-ton was right up under the floor, and then you didn't buy any more coal until June when it was cheap again.
Mm-hmm.
You bought it then, your 16-ton, and then you didn't buy any more till the next June. And you had better heat than you had with oil or gas, because there was always a fire in the pot. Much better heat. But it was a nuisance. You had to take care of it. And my job was my mother was very notorious. The banking the fire at night, you had to sift the ashes, and she would. We had a grinder. I remember I was about 8 or 9 years old, and we put the ashes in this grinder, and you wind the thing, and the ashes went down into the can, and the cinders went out into a bucket we had there. Now you put water on those, and you bank the fire with that. This is how you make the coal last. She was a very glorious old lady, but she was wonderful. I think that takes care of painting out there, and the things that are in the cabinet. They have a display case. Is there anything?
I think it'd be interesting to weave a fuller tale of the Jackson White's families who are in Morristown. Maybe that's something we could think about and attempt to do.
Well, I know that the Ridges are descended from them. In fact, this man was connected way back to the Ridgey family. The Petersons in town are connected to this man and to the Ridgeys way back. And there are some Petersons still here, aren't there?
I was on Island Avenue, so I'm not sure.
Peterson?
Yeah, I'm not
Well,
sure.
they're the same people. They're descended from those folks. And who else in town are descended from these people?
Do you think these families today know of that?
I don't think they really know.
My uncle would probably be surprised to see that picture. Really?
Bring him over.
Yeah.
I think your Mr. Ritchie knows whose family is, yes. But I don't know whether they really know the background of the family. I don't really know whether they do or not. I don't know whether they've been interested in that or not.
Do you think it would please them to know?
I think it should.
It all depends upon how old they are. As they grow older, they get more interested.
There's also a family in town who were Pitneys. They were all born on a Pitney farm in Mendon. And they're not Pitneys now, but their grandmother was a Pitney. I remember it very well. And my nephew is married to the granddaughter of that Miss Pitney. But they were all born on the Pitney farm in Mendon. Well, this is way back before the Civil War, really. The Pitneys had slaves, you say.
That's a question that frequently comes up in the library. What estates or plantations there were where there were slaves in this area?
Jersey didn't have plantations, North Jersey especially, because we were not that kind of an agricultural state.
Didn't Peter Kemble call his
He
place
did.
a plantation?
It was at that time, yes, it was a big place, but he didn't have slaves as you would think of in the South. He had 20 or 30 slaves, and that was an awful lot of slaves in New Jersey for one person to own. But in the South, there'd be 200 or 300 on a plantation. It was nothing to have 200 people on a plantation. After all, plantations were 15 miles apart, and there would be probably 200 on a big plantation, 200 slaves here. 15 miles away, there would be another plantation with maybe 100. And that was one reason why in the South they frowned on slaves having meetings, getting together, because they were always so afraid of an insurrection. Because you see, there were so few whites in the country. I mean, in the outlying sections, there'd be a family of 3 or 4, and there would be hundreds of slaves. And so there was a law that slaves could not assemble more than 3, not more than 3. But the slaves got around that by turning pots down at the corners of the building so that the noise didn't leave the room. Nobody knew that. This is something they found out in Africa, something they brought with them. You never heard it before, did you?
What's that?
They turned great pots down on the corners of the room, and the sound didn't leave the room. My grandmother used to tell us.
Upside down.
Upside down, yes.
An earthen pot or
No.
a metal pot?
Metal pots.
A
great
metal pot.
pots. But it was against the law for more than 3 to assemble unless the master was present. Because there were insurrections, you know. But these people were not all happy. They weren't happy being slaves, let's face it. And so there were insurrections. And my grandmother used to tell us about Nat Turner's insurrection. And it really was quite something. The man really almost turned things around there. And, but when they would correct a thing like that, they'd hang all these people and leave them hanging for days as an example, so this wouldn't happen again. They would try to strike fear into the hearts of anybody who had any ideas like this. But grandmother used to tell us about some of these things. My grandma was born in 1812. So that's quite a while back. She could remember a great many things. And she loved to tell us about these things. And many, many people, many blacks, didn't know much about the past because they were sold as chattel. We were sold, and families were broken up. And so, especially if you did something that displeased your owner, he'd sell you. Or if you were a man who didn't work very well, you were sold. And so families were broken up. Women were the leaders of the family. They usually kept the women with the children. And so you had a matriarchal society. Still do, I think. And there was reason for this, because the women were the people who the family centered around, because they were kept with the children usually. But men were often sold off. It all depended on whether the man was energetic or whatever. And so you had this to contend with. And so families didn't know each other very well. Children were sometimes divided. And, it was very often, if there was a marriage and a family, or if there was an estate to be settled, that a family would be split, and children would be, this son would get so many people, and this son would get so many people, and so families were split. And so again, you lost track of who you were. Always when a girl got married, she was given a lady's maid. Some child had grown up in the same age as she was and played with as a child. She was given that person as a lady's maid. This was a very difficult situation. So families very rarely stayed together. Mr. What's-his-name, who wrote the book, Goods, you could see that through that book, how they were sold off and that sort of thing. Occasionally, people stayed together. We were fortunate on my mother's side of the family that they lived in one place for over 200 years. Very fortunate. That this wasn't the usual thing. And most people don't really know too much about it because they were separated. It was a divide and conquer thing. Divide and hold your position. Because at the time of the Civil War, there were more blacks in the South than there were whites. This was always a dangerous situation so far as that was concerned. And I don't think this has ever been, we never learned this in school. It's only now that people talk about it. Something that people just didn't talk about. We talked about it in our house. My mother was always, she wanted us to know everything. She told us. She was an old school teacher, and she told us everything. She'd buy any book. There was a man named Dr. Kelly Miller, who was one of the early professors at Howard University. And he used to come north to lecture. And my mother would buy every book that Dr. Kelly, and this man Woodson, she'd buy all of his books. In our library at home, we have all those old books. And so, for us, this was nothing new. Black history is nothing new for me.
John, tell how it happened that your family came to these parts.
Well, we came here because the school my mother went to, the trustees of that school, some of them were Morristown people. This Graves family who lived on South Street. And in the summer, well, in Virginia, there was only school for 6 months because the other 6 months, people had to work, and the children had to work in the field. So you went to school for 6 months. So the 6 months that my mother taught, she was there. And then the other 6 months, she had to find something to do. So she came north to Jersey to work those 6 months. And she earned more money here working than she earned teaching in Virginia, so she stayed. And I think this happened and I know this happened at that time with most of the early families who came here. Many of them were teachers in the South. And they came here and they earned more money here. And after all, that's the name of the game. And so they stayed here. And they'd write for their friends or relatives, and they would come, and they stayed. And that's how the first of the earliest Southern Negroes came to these parts. Because you'd write for your relatives or your friends, and because you were lonely here, and then another person would come. And so that's how my family came here. And they came in the early 1880s to Newark, and to Morristown. Here, our relatives lived here. They came to Newark first. Again, my mother would send for her cousins, and they'd come and they'd get a job. And they came to Morristown. Some of them are in the 1880s, 1890s, and so that's how we happened to come to these parts. Another thing, in the South, these people had always owned, after the Civil War, the main thing that was sort of drilled into your head was to own some property, own your house. This gave you independence, to own your house. And so the first thing they do, as soon as they get here, they work hard and put aside a little money to buy a house. So you wouldn't have a landlord. You wanted a house. And this is what they did. They got a house. And it was drilled in to own a piece of property. And I don't know, today I don't think we do that with children today. It was very vital because it gave you prestige and something that you could own and say was your own. That was very necessary. So all these people who came here, they buy houses essentially, and they'd go into some sort of little business. Now we had 2 or 3 coal men small coal businesses here. We had a very large ice business, the second largest in the area that Mr. Gregory owned. And several taxi businesses. In fact, all the early taxi men, excepting Welsh and Baltimore, was one of them. They were all coming. Welsh was not, and neither was Murphy's father, who was in the taxi business here for about 110 years. The Murphy family all the way down. Well, they were not. The whole professional car taxi men, this is 50, 60 years ago. And all the rubbish men will come. It's now been taken off by the tax, but it was all come in those days. And all those people bought houses. They didn't earn an awful lot of money, but they saved something and bought houses and raised families too. Thank you. I think that's about it that I can say. I mean, there's an awful lot that can be said. You can reminisce.
Write it down.
Oh, please do.
to reminisce about all this. As a child, I remember we raised pigs in Morristown. No one will believe it. But we raised pigs. And there were about 6 or 7 families that had pigs. And each week you took a turn to feed the pigs. And then on the day before Thanksgiving Day, you slaughtered them. Slaughtered them that morning. But the night before, the men would go, our parents would go and dig a great trench and have a great fire there, you know. And they throw these stones in there, they have the stones red hot, and these great large galvanized tubs, water. And then we kids would get up about 7 o'clock, we were sent out there. And they would, by this time, they would slaughter the pigs and have them hanging in tripods. And then they would dip these pigs in these great tubs of water. And then we kids would take a stick and rub the fur off them, you know, the hair off the pigs. And then they'd be quartered and given the 6 or 7 men who owned the pigs. They would invite their friends and they would divide it with their friends who'd help them to slaughter. And that was on early Thanksgiving morning. It was a wonderful thing for a boy to grow up and have this sort of experience. These people had done this in Virginia and in North Carolina, and they brought it with them. And this meat was then salted down. I have the chest in my cellar now. It's 8 feet long. It was packed in there, salt and saltpeter, and you had it all winter, all summer. It was wonderful. To think about it, we had a wonderful time. And we didn't know we were having a good time. We didn't. We thought it was just making the ends meet, you know, but we didn't realize that. When you look back at it now, and I don't think people have. And the main thing in those days was to own a piano. Well, my father was in the piano business, but this was something that you didn't have television, you didn't have radio. In order to be cultivated, you had to have a child who played the piano. This was it. And so you'd go without, they'd go without something that they needed. To give lessons to one of the boys and girls, he had to be musical. He had to play a piano, and you had to own one. These are all little things I can think of in growing up, I mean, as a child.
How did you spend Sundays, John?
Well, Sunday, you got up in the morning, and the first thing, in our family, the first thing we did was come down to the parlor. I live in an old house, and it has a parlor and a back parlor, library, and it's an old house. You'd come down the parlor, and my mother read the lesson and said the prayers. You then had breakfast and went to church. And then you came home after church. Your principal meal was in the middle of the day. And you had your principal meal, and I never remember a Sunday that we didn't have company. We always had somebody who came to eat with us on Sunday, always. Not one, sometimes half a dozen. And there were, of course, older people. They sat down first and ate, and then the children sat down next. And sometimes you were worried for fear the food would give out. But it never gave out. It never seemed to give out. There was always plenty of food. And of course, early Sunday morning from April until October, my father would get up and chop the ice. Mr. Gregory was my uncle, so he'd bring the ice, chop the ice, and he made 6 quarts of ice cream. You had to grind that. He had that every Sunday from April until October. This 6 quarts of ice cream was ground, and the idea as a little boy was to be there when the dasher was pulled out, so that you got the dasher, you know, that was the ice cream stuff, the dasher. The most wonderful thing. These are things you remember now. Kids don't have this. There's nothing to remember anymore, this sort of thing. And then, of course, after church and after dinner in the middle of the day, we played croquet. It was considered the proper thing on Sunday to do, because you couldn't play.
Couldn't roller skate, huh?
How's that?
Couldn't roller skate.
No. You played croquet, and that was something you could be dressed up and play croquet with wickets, you know. So we played croquet, and then at 4:30 you had tea. You had tea in our house, and then after that, if the family was together, my mother was very religious. So again, you had evening prayers were read. If they weren't together, you didn't have evening prayers. If we'd sort of gone our separate ways, I mean, the older children of the family, then that was a different story. But if we were there, my mother would get us together and say the evening prayers. She was really a very religious woman, very good person. So far as that, I remember her with great joy. And I lived with her 42 years, so that's quite a while. But our house was a very pleasant house. I live in the same house, the same everything. I haven't bought a thing. I've got the same old furniture, same old rug, same everything. And I love it just as I did when I was a child.
It's a lovely house.
It's been a lovely life.
Don, it's hard to let you go. The only thing to remedy that is to do it again, do
Thank
it
you.
some more, because it's all interesting, every bit of it. We thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. So do stop as you go by and look with new eyes at what John has put in the case for the day before you hustle on out. Also, there's some more eats in there if anybody feels inclined. And maybe if you grab another snack, you don't need to eat supper.
We're going to make a thing. Oh, I need the key to get into the refrigerator.
So, we got it. I think it was interesting.
Oh, really? Oh, Clara!
You made it, I swear. It's Clara, but you gotta go to the missionary. John did his stuff.
Oh,
Clara, John got,
where are you?
John,
Where's Clara?
but I'm here.
Clara, wonderful.
We couldn't have it
The day
without
would
Clara.
be complete without Clara.
We'd have to run into her.
How are you? How are you?
She's been doing that.
Well, I
Clara had too many things done.
She always has a lot of things to do. Well, have you ever been to Haiti?
No.
Do you have a desire to go there?
Just now, don't look at the chart. Look at each other. Look at each other. Everybody look at John.
John, one thing you didn't talk about was, we talked about voodoo.
Oh, no, I didn't.
And I think that's a topic that interests people a
Well,
lot.
it is, but that's a big topic.
Yeah, that's a topic all by
Yes,
itself.
it is. Mine, look at Rick.
People
Always,
talking to each other, Johnny.
that's a waste of time. When we take pictures, we take one shot.
Yeah.
But when you're a photographer, they shoot them all.
I'm not photogenic, I'm starting to break that.
I don't think you are.
So it gets cut. Oh, is that right? That's right, too fast, he didn't shut his
Now you're Richie?
I'm related to it. Dear mother. The name you're talking about. This is my father's sister.
That's a table.
No, this is the other one. You don't have, I don't have it. No, I get,
He must have it.
that painting was given to him. That painting was given to him.
Oh, then he does have.
Yes, he must have it. Yeah, look around. Lois Pearson. Right, look around, ask him if he has.
No, you don't have all that.
He has one in that style, he has. And he's the one that wore a hat, he wore a sports hat. Very, very much.
No, it was a skippy. It was a skippy.
Really?
The skippiest ever. But 300 of those flyers went somewhere.
They might have had it down the street, that's what they,
Well, of course, I didn't hear it. But, last year we did.
yeah.
And I